Hi everyone, welcome back. Part L, Transit and Transport Impacts and how you need to address them in a TIA. This is something that doesn't really seem to happen very often yet, but we're starting to see a gradual movement towards the idea that you might need to be thinking not just about traffic but also the impacts that your new development is going to have on transit and on the transport network as a whole, so thinking about bicycles and pedestrians. So let's look at some of the more obvious things. First of all, there could be some transit impacts from additional traffic that your new development is generating. That might end up delaying transit vehicles. So you can see here, this is Bathurst Street in Toronto again. You've got a whole load of cars turning left because remember in Toronto they drive on the opposite side of the road. And so these two cars here turning left are actually delaying the streetcar, which is trying to get to this streetcar stop here. And so you can imagine what's going to happen when this development, which is the development site that we're talking about, all the way through this series of videos, when this gets developed, we're going to have the same problem happen going the opposite way. Vehicles turning left into the site could potentially delay transit. So here again is the relevant bit from the transport report, looking at streetcar delay. So there's some information there about how many left turns there are going to be under future conditions and future background conditions, so you can see what the impact is. And then there's been a bit of a field study. People have gone out there and actually done a survey of how many seconds these vehicles, the existing vehicles, are delaying transit by. And then you work your way down through this, and there's some modelling done and all of that sort of stuff. And finally, you get to that lovely sentence, which is what you're sort of aiming for with all of these things, is the ability to say that the impacts of the additional traffic aren't going to be all that bad, they'll be minimal. And if you can't get to that sort of sentence, you'd then have to be doing something along the lines of, well, there's going to be impacts, but we are addressing them by doing this and doing that. Maybe you end up having to put in a new signal that gives transit priority or doing something. Maybe you end up having to pay the transit authority a bit of money because they now have to have an extra vehicle on that route because it's now delayed by just enough that, you know, they want to try and keep the same frequency, but you have to pay them some money so that they can pay an extra driver and buy an extra bus or something along those lines. So that's sort of how that sort of process might get done. Looking at a similar sort of issue, what are going to be the transit impacts from all the added passengers that your development might generate? So here we are looking back at one of the earlier examples of a traffic report. And you'd notice that we did have an estimate that be 100 people who'd be driving and 20 people who'd be passengers in cars. But then we got another 100 people who are passengers in transit and another 120 who are going to walk or cycle. So where are they going to go? What are we going to do about that? By the time you work all that way down to the peak hours, we've got 45 extra trips on transit, 50 trips walking and cycling. A bus only carries 50 people or so, maybe 70 or 80 if you really push them in hard during peak hour and everybody's standing up, or you've got a bendy bus or a double-decker bus. So does that mean that you might need an extra bus an hour to generate, to cover the demand from this building? Possibly, depends where they're all going. These sorts of things don't tend to get addressed very much in traffic impact statements because they're also focused on cars. And I think we're seeing this movement now to transport impact statements where we're looking at larger impacts on the transport network as a whole. And we might see sometimes developers not only having to put in an extra traffic lane, but maybe put in some money to help buy an extra bus or help pay for an extra driver or something along those lines. You can see this spot here in Richmond Station. I was there just after a Collingwood game got out at the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, for those of you who aren't familiar with Melbourne. And we're already at capacity here. So the question would be, should you be adding an extra train on, and who should be paying for that? And I suppose that's what comes down to with these developments. If you're already at capacity on the transit network during the peak hour, you might not be able to add all of your extra people on. And so this idea that 100 people are going to take transit and 45, you're going to get 45 trips on transit, and that's going to reduce your traffic load, might not actually hold true in reality if you are already at these sorts of loads. Some of the other impacts you might have to think about, what's going to be the impact of your new development on cyclists, on pedestrians. Here we are in Swanston Street in Melbourne on the left. It's already very busy. Should the development be helping to extend the footpath a little bit further so that there's a bit more space for people to move around? And here we are in Toronto. Even in the middle of winter, someone is out there riding their bike. You can imagine how busy this spot is during the summer. Even in winter, the bike parking is overflowing on the street. So should this development, as part of its having a reasonable impact on the street environment, should it be helping to make the bike lanes wider, or should it be providing bike lanes if they don't exist? Particularly if you are expecting that there's going to be 50 trips on walking and cycling, maybe that's something that the development should be doing, or that the local council might require the development to do, so that the development can be reasonably accommodated. What about other modes? It's rare, but you do occasionally have people skating to work. These things happen. Should the development, if you're going to put a development right next to the canal, should there be some sort of skating park? That's a bit of a silly example, I know, but an example that you might think of initially as being silly is real. Here we are in the western area of Ontario. Well, not that far west actually. The city of Waterloo has a large community who use horses and buggies to get around. And so horse and buggy parking is something that you see. Allowing for horse and buggy parking is something that you would have to do under the zoning bylaw requirements. And in the same way, when you think about putting in a new road to get to your development, you might need to have a specific design so that buggy traffic can be accommodated. There's all manner of things that you might have to think about, and it's always going to be very site specific. Here we are back at the Bathurst Street example. You'll remember from some of those site location maps that the Bathurst Street site is actually just really close to the hospital, which means that there's ambulances coming down. And so if you've got an ambulance coming in all the time, you are actually going to have to think about, are you going to have an impact on people getting to the hospital? And so the typical approach is you get out there, you do some counts, you survey the ambulance movements, you make an assessment as to how much traffic you're adding and whether you're going to do something that's going to get in the way of the existing use. And so whether your proposed development is reasonable, or whether you need to do something, add an extra lane, do something or other, put in some special turning movement things, do something or other so that your development can be reasonably accommodated.